Welcome everyone to Citizen Climate Lobby Canada's May 2nd education call with Guy Dauncey. I'm really excited to have him back with us again. Following the money is something we like to do at Citizens Climate Lobby. For those of you who don't know Guy, he is the co-founder of the West Coast Climate Action Network. And for the past 7 years, he's been researching and writing his yet to be published book, The Economics of Kindness: How to End the Economics of Selfishness and Build an Economy that Works for All. I would just like to get this started right away. So thank you for being here today, Guy. And for everyone, please introduce yourself in the chat. And at the end, there'll be time for questions. Go ahead, please.
All righty. Welcome, everyone. I want to say sometimes I speak too fast. And so I got a little system set up. So if you go to the reaction buttons at the bottom and look at the emojis and click to the right, you'll find a green frog. If I'm speaking too fast, put that green frog in there. Let's test it now, see if you can find it. Find the green frog and put it up there. Then I'll know to slow down. Although I've only got tiny little images of you. You can only see 5 of you at the side, so I can't see many of you anyway, so it may not work. I may just need to have Kathy tell me if there's a green frog. Yeah, there's Kathy's frog. So Kathy, if you see a green frog, I've got your image, that'll work. So I have been working for 7 years to writing this book called On the Economics of Kindness: How to End the Economics of Selfishness and Build an Economy that Works for All. Still seeking a publisher. I'm deeply involved in the climate movement. I co-founded the West Coast Climate Action Network 2 years ago. Every 3 or 4 times a year, we hold a big climate action provincial assembly. We have 243 member organizations in British Columbia, and we're trying to sort of, do the work of mobilizing everyone into one big movement. 2 years ago, I wrote a major piece called Climate Emergency, a 26-week transition program for Canada, which I presented to MPs and senators in Ottawa with Elizabeth May. And coming up 20 years ago, I wrote this book called Stormy Weather: 201 Solutions to Global Climate Change. And then 10 years later, I followed it up with the Climate Challenge: 101 Solutions to Global Warming. And then I wrote this major book, this novel called Journey to the Future. And I found this, it's set in Vancouver in the year 2032, when Vancouver's become one of the greenest cities in the world. And I found this little thing on the right-hand side in Goodreads, which I was feeling very chuffed about. So, but back in the 1980s, I was already working on this realm with a book called After the Crash: The Emergence of the Rainbow Economy, focused much more at the community level. So just to give a sense of context, because we're going to be limited today in what we're talking about, the new economy covers all of these realms. And any one of these could be an hour's focused talk of what's needed to make progress in this stuff. So this is stuff I'm not talking about today, because there's so much stuff there. I have a column in Corporate Knights, and I've recently done articles on 6 ways to reduce the cost of food, to reduce economic inequality, and stuff like that, which you can find at Corporate Knights. And I wrote this piece called 7 Ways to Tackle Inflation Without Raising Interest Rates, which is what piqued Kathy's interest and asked me initially to do the talk on these 7 ways to tackle inflation. But then I realized it actually needs to be a bit broader than that. So we're going to bring in the central banking. So this is complex, it's confusing, and for some it's going to be controversial. Some people, especially older men with gray hair like myself, have strong opinions on this stuff, right? So we live on this beautiful planet. And in our caring for the planet, we include our caring for nature and the desire that nature can live in beauty and peace and unpolluted harmony, and that children and humans can as well. So the positive vision of where we want to be is such an important part of the new economics and of our climate action. Tucked away within that planet, we need to address inflation, inequality, power, and the climate and biodiversity crisis. So these 4 pieces I'll be touching on today. They're sort of behind the scenes, constantly lurking. So inflation has many causes. That's in Canada's inflation rate. It has supply side, it can be caused by supply side disruptions like COVID, the Ukraine war. I'm going to go back to each of them and look at their solutions. Profits push inflations, when companies use market power to jack up prices using the fog of inflation. That's a metaphor for the fog of war when stuff goes on, also known as greedflation. It can be caused by the increased price of oil due to oil dependency and oligopolies. It can be caused by the increased price of housing and rent due to the failure of federal housing policies over 40 years and central banks printing too much money as quantitative easing. It can be caused by wages push inflation when workers demand more pay to keep up with inflation. It can be caused by falling currency. If your currency is collapsing, all your imports are going to cost a lot more, driving inflation. It can be caused by excess aggregate demand, causing an economy to overheat, and by central bank money printing in excess of the economy's ability to absorb it. So there's 8 different causes. It is not caused by increased government expenditures, which is a common conservative pitch line. It says every new dollar put into an economy by its government is balanced by a dollar taken out, either in taxes to pay for a deficit or bonds purchased to finance a government deficit. But given these 8 reasons, there's only ever one solution: raise the bank rate. Why do we only have one solution? So the theory of central banks economists is that inflation is caused when the economy overheats, putting pressure on the markets to deliver, causing prices to rise. Their belief is that by raising interest rates, money becomes more expensive to borrow, cooling aggregate demand. But excessive aggregate demand was only one of those 8 causes of the climate crisis. So this needs a deeper dive. I should also add at this point, in case I didn't cover it in a later slide, that these economists are invariably trained in neoclassical economics. And one of the assumptions of neoclassical economics is that market economy works perfectly and you want the minimum government interference. So they don't like government policies to address inflation, while ignoring the fact that raising interest rates is market interference, because it's not driven by a natural price system in the market. So is it because economists have been trained in neoclassical economics, which teaches that the market knows best and government intervention is best to be encouraged? Or is it because raising interest rates brings increased profits to the bankers and investors who have the most power and dumps the pain on low-income workers and their families, especially people of color who have the least ability to get involved in debates about bank rates and stuff like that? Generally speaking, those people feel overwhelmed, bored, confused, and muddled when it comes to this kind of discussion. So for our purposes, there are 3 kinds of money. There are coins and banknotes, which are 3% of the money in circulation. Money created by banks as debt, knowing that for every million in reserves, a bank is allowed to create, say, 20 million and charge interest on it. And then money created by central banks, printed out of thin air, out of trust in the financial system. The money created by banks is all reciprocal debt. The money created by central banks is not. And the big discussion is, what is the origin of money? Is something that economists have written massively complicated books on. And I have come to a very clear, simple example. So Theresa May, when the Prime Minister of England, when being asked to spend money, said, oh, there is no magic money tree. But actually there is a magic money tree. Because money, all money, apart from that 3%, is created out of thin air. And in Britain, 85% of the members of Parliament were totally unaware that new money is created every time a bank extends a loan, or when a central bank prints money. So most of our MPs are not aware of this stuff. Actually, there's 2 magic money trees: high street banks producing money and Bank of England producing money. So this is a British example of the green is the money in cash, and the red is money created by the banks. That's how the economy works. So what is the origins of this money created as debt? So I like to go back to imagine hunter-gatherers sitting around a campfire. And he's thinking, I owe Frida for that beautiful robe she made me. He's thinking, I owe Magnus for the spear he gave me. She's thinking, Ragnar owes me for that robe I made him. She's thinking, I owe my cousin Ingrid for the way she braided my hair. If you could digitalize their thoughts, you've got money. That's the legal word. Money is credit created as reciprocal debt based on people's trust that the debts will be repaid. It's as simple as that. And I believe humans have a right to generate trust and to offer reciprocal loans to each other. It's a fundamental part of being alive. So banks create money every time they extend credit to a customer. Neoclassical economics does not accept this or acknowledge it. And it was only in 2013 when the governor of the Bank of England said, actually, this is true. When banks extend loans to their customers, they create money by crediting their customer's account at the touch of a digital button. When the debt's repaid, the money ceases to exist. But the interest they charge, that has to come out of your own pocket. And if it's not being generated by increased productivity, it's coming literally from your earnings and something else. So when we look at the Bank of Canada, we have a second question, like what is central bank money? So let's go back to our hunter-gatherers around the campfire. They're thinking, all of them, Thor is ill, he needs our help. Let's throw him a feast. They're going to create that as a non-reciprocal gift. They do not expect Thor to return them. He may be elderly, he may be unable to return it. They're creating that money out of expression of the collective trust in the tribe or clan as a whole, and they can chip in. So that you can digitalize that and it becomes money. So in a cooperative economy, money is created as a gift, as an extension of trust in the tribe as a whole to one who's in need. But if this was done too often, it would create an inflation of expectations and devaluation of tribal trust. In other words, inflation. So you can't do this too often or you get inflation. When a central bank creates money, it should do so as an expression of trust in the nation as a whole to protect its people from a crisis. And that would include a climate crisis or affordable housing crisis. But central banks operate on the premise that their purpose is to protect the economy, which they interpret as, which usually means protecting it from the disastrous consequences of reckless investments by their fellow bankers. So let's put central banking on the shelf for now and get back to inflation. I want to go through those 8 methods, then we'll return to central banking. So inflation has many causes. Supply side disruptions. The solutions to this are, number one, let the market respond as best it can. Because businesses are active. If they see there's a price rise or something else and they get out there and make it, they're going to do so. And for the government needs to invest in initiatives to strengthen national resilience and lessen those supply chain dependencies. So that's what Biden is doing in America, creating chip manufacturing so that all our chips don't come from Taiwan and China, and they're screwed up. So everything grinds to a halt if there's no chips. So lessening supply chain dependencies is the fundamental solution to that kind of stuff. And the same goes for energy, very obviously. It's increasing the bank rate does nothing to resolve supply side disruptions. Then you've got profits push inflation, where companies use their market power to jack up prices. So when the Canadian economist Jim Stanford analyzed profits in 52 Canadian business sectors, he found that compared to before the pandemic, their combined after-tax profits of the 15 most profitable sectors had increased by 89% during the pandemic, while the profits in all other sectors fell. Average Canadian profits, which ran from 5 to 10% between 1960 and 2000, for these 15 sectors, rose to 20%, while corporations enjoyed their lowest ever tax rate. The big culprits were the oil and gas companies, followed by the banks, financial intermediaries, mining, groceries, and home maintenance. Home maintenance, because during COVID, everyone's getting there to fix the kitchen and stuff. Together, they took out 143 billion out of the pockets of businesses and consumers, which is 5% of Canada's GDP, representing more than half of the current inflation. This then had a knock-on effect, further increasing prices for food and other consumer goods. So the same thing happened in Britain, where corporate profits were 73% higher in 2021 than in 2019. And in America, where quarterly profits were 50% higher in 2022 than in the 8 years before the pandemic. So there's definitely been profiteering, and there's no way that raising the bank rate stops that. The solutions are to be willing to impose a windfall profits tax. In America, Bernie Sanders called for a 95% windfall profits tax. In Portugal, parliaments approved a 33% tax on windfall profits by energy companies and food retailers. The European Union wants to raise 140 billion euros by taxing the windfall earnings of energy companies to help with their massive gas and electricity bills. The second solution is to enact antitrust regulations, because the companies that do this could not do it if they were not oligopolies, where they effectively control the price. In an ideal open economy, open market, as soon as one company started profiteering and raising the price, other companies will say, we can undercut you. Here we are, cheaper prices. That doesn't happen when you have an oligopolistic situation. So that's the positive money in Britain demanding windfall tax on bank profits. Just a sign, not on left field here. There's other people saying the same stuff. Then we have the increased price of oil. And the solution here is speed up the transition to sustainable transportation. If you don't drive a conventional car, price of oil has much less impact. And if the grocery stores don't have to, if they're all electric trucks. And so linked to this, especially for the Citizens Climate Lobby, continue to increase the carbon tax, but distribute the rebate as a physical check in the mail, not an obscure line on your bank statement which says, e.g., Canada FPT. Nobody knows that they're getting the carbon tax rebate unless they know what those obscure lines mean. So that enables 30% of Canadians, the Conservatives, to go on insisting that it's a theft and it's a rip-off and stuff like that, because they just haven't really registered they're getting the rebates. It's a policy error that the Canadian government's making in the way they distribute the check. Fourth cause, increased price of housing and rent. So between 20 and 21, apartment rents in Canada rose from 1,600 to almost 2,000. In London, 37%, Calgary, 30%, Vancouver and Toronto. In those cities, tenants are paying up to $600 to $1,000 more every month. And for many mortgage holders, the higher interest rates are really hurting. Solutions, urgent investments in affordable housing and related policy initiatives. There's a whole story there, not covering it today, but there's an awful lot that can be done. And raising the bank rate does not reduce rents, doesn't tackle this problem. Finally, we've got wages push inflation. So once wage inflation is set in, workers need wage increases to keep up. Since 2017, prices in Canada have risen by 20%. So low and middle income workers whose wages are not increased are actually contributing to reduced demand. And if the purpose of raising the bank rate is to reduce demand, workers are already doing it because they got less money to spend. So central banks often blame inflation on workers' wage demands rather than it says 5 other causes, the 7 other causes, which is where it belongs. Solution, give workers a pay rise. Nearly 2/3 of Canadian workers' wages are falling behind the rate of inflation. Over the past 2 years, public sector's workers' wages grew by less than the rate of inflation. Last year, health workers and social assistance workers are 2.1%, educational workers 1.6%, public admin workers 1.5%. Now, as of yesterday, with the strike being resolved, I believe they got around 9%, not up to 12% spread over 3 years. So they're getting 4% a year. So the strike has been effective. Underpaid workers are actually dampening inflationary pressure, since their lack of income means they consume less, spending less money on food and heat, and they have more risk of eviction. It cannot be right to tame inflation by placing the burden on those least able to bear it. Solution really also that is expand the labor market. Canada has a record number of job vacancies, causing employers to increase wages to attract workers. So we need to increase immigration beyond the current level of 50,000 a year, invest in training opportunities for all Canadians, accelerate the construction of affordable housing that's an extra, 200,000 houses a year just for the new immigrants, and expand affordable childcare and seniors care, enabling more parents and caregivers to return to work instead of having to stay at home to do childcare and seniors care. Another cause is when your currency is falling, so your imports are costing more. The solution is increased domestic production, especially for food. And then in Switzerland, this is what they've been doing, to buy and sell foreign currency and use interest rates to affect the value of the Swiss franc. Reduce the interest rate to prevent overvaluation, discouraging exports, and increase it to prevent undervaluation, which makes imported goods more expensive. And the fact that the Swiss National Bank and government are doing this gives me confidence that I'm not sort of totally wacko in bringing this into the picture. 7, we cover the classic thing, excessive aggregate demand, the only cause that the central banks really believe in. So here's the thing. Between 2018 and 2022, the world's central banks gave $41 trillion in quantitative easing to banks and corporations, which did inflate asset prices in the housing and stock markets, which is where the money ended up. So that inflation was hidden from general consumers who except with regard to housing, when everyone really noticed it. And 90% of Canadians, or maybe 95%, don't own stocks in the stock market, so they didn't notice that. So an analysis by the Institute for New Economic Thinking found that increased aggregate demand in America is definitely a contributing cause of the current inflation. But 40% of the increased demand is coming from the wealthiest 1%, and 75% from the wealthiest 10%, who made immense gains in personal wealth during the pandemic as a result of quantitative easing and are now busy spending it. So the central bank's policies of quantitative easing or printing money did get into the real economy, mainly in housing and stock markets, but then the cash got into the wealthiest people's pockets, who then spent it in regular stuff, pushing up prices. This is an analysis you do not see coming across on journalists in Canada. Solution: increased taxation on the wealthy. We don't need to cool general demand, we need to cool demand by the wealthiest 10%. This is best achieved not by raising interest rates, which impacts everyone, but by increasing taxation on those who are already rich, for whom, quite frankly, inflation is not a problem. If you've got enough money in the bank and savings, and you have to pay an extra 10% on food, it's no big deal. You just pay it. You've got savings. It is the people at the bottom end of the economy who don't have savings, who have to just, go without in order to, or go without food most often to pay their rents and stuff like that. So that's the solution to that one. So before we get to the 8th cause of inflation, which is money printing by the central bank, we need to take a closer look at central banking, take it back off the shelf. So here's how it works and why it causes inflation. When a government orders its central bank to print money, the results can be disastrous, causing hyperinflation. Germany 1922, Hungary 1945, Argentina, and others. This is a bad thing. This is why central bankers insist on independence from governments. Picture Donald Trump being president of America, having total control over the central bank and what he'd like to do with that cash if he had control of it. It's a disaster. Anyway, during 1992 to 2020, Canada's inflation rate was stable at around 2%. And the Bank of Canada's asset sheet, which is the total of money created, was stable at around $50 billion. In 2009, it created another $25 billion to tackle the financial crisis. In 2020, to confront COVID, it cut the interest rate to 0.25% and created $420 billion, which it injected into the economy by buying bonds and other debt from governments and businesses. And that's the details where the numbers come from. How does a central bank inject money into the economy? They buy bonds or securities of banks or corporations, putting that much extra money simply into their accounts. They call it increasing the credit supply, injecting liquidity, monetizing the deficit, buying securities, expanding the balance sheet, quantitative easing. And most people haven't a clue what that means. They just, the brains glaze over and you move on to the next thing. The theory is that banks will lend the money to businesses, which will use it to make new investments and hire new people. But that's not what happened. The banks preferred, because they got much extra profits, to lend the extra money into the housing market, pushing prices through the roof. And in 2020, the corporations preferred to spend the new money on share buybacks, boosting the value of their stock. So at the beginning of COVID in 2020, when we were obsessed with watching the COVID rates and the dramas unfold, there was a massive financial collapse because the banks and the corporations rather saw all their demand collapsing and they had to pay their debts really in a hurry. And the stock market collapsed from like 29,000 to 20,000 in a period of 2 weeks. And there was panic going on, which was never revealed in the media. Central banks jumped in, quantitative easing, poured money back in, and everything recovered. Stock market got back to 35,000 points when no one was spending anything. And the journalists thought, this is good news, wonderful, the economy is recovering. Not really what happened. So this is a measure of the central bank's balance sheets. Orange at the bottom is the Bank of Japan, Europe, the purple is European Central Bank, green is US Federal Bank, and then you've got Swiss Bank, the Bank of England. So on the left-hand side after 2008, you see the jump when they did money printing to stop the financial crisis. Then they continued printing all the way through up till 2018 to help they weren't getting recovery from the financial crisis. So they keep on pumping in money to support the stock market and pump the housing market, which they interpret as a great thing because wealthy people love that stuff. Then in 2020, you'll see a massive central bank purchasing of trillions of financial securities to mitigate the COVID-19 crisis. This is how the Bank of England did it, for instance, where the money went of the money they pumped in. So a tiny amount, almost no increase went into business, the financial sector. Public sector, almost nothing. Personal loans, almost nothing. The money went into commercial property. But look at the financial sector and then mortgages and secured loans. That's where the money, which is the housing market. So the money created directly by the Bank of England was poured into the housing market, inflating the price of housing, which we all know about, and then inflating the price of rents. But it wasn't called inflation because the Bank of Canada only calls inflation something that increases the general consumer price index. Who benefits? Everyone who owns property. Who loses? Everyone on the wrong side of the property divide, who've been really struggling. So this is what happened to the Dow Jones. The same thing. So we got it rolling along until 2007. It gets up to nearly 15,000 points. Financial crash, collapses. And then as the money is poured in, it recovers. And then we get to the COVID crisis in 2020. You see that deep hole in the thing, and then recovery. Got back up to 35,000. It's still up to that level entirely because of money created by the central bank, which should have been for the benefit of all, but ends up as the benefit to the 10% financial elites, which is partly why they got richer and richer and richer during COVID, and the rest of us did not. Who benefits? Everyone who owns shares. Who falls further behind? Everyone who doesn't own shares. And the shareholders just laugh because their financial value has doubled. Well, from 2010, when it's 10,000, it's tripled. They haven't lifted a finger. They just sit and enjoy the benefits. And so fair enough to the pension funds, which we all benefit from, but the private shareholders just laughing all the way to the bank. So why did the Dow Jones recover so quickly when the whole world was in lockdown? It's because the federal bank and other central banks printed $30 trillion of brand new money, and they gave it to the corporations by buying securities and debts off them. So literally, the banks had securities they couldn't sell because no one wanted to buy them, and suddenly central banks took it off them, and they're flush with cash. What did they do with it? They did not use it to expand their businesses and take on employees. They used it for share buybacks, buying their own stock, which inflated the price of their stock and made them all rich at the same time. So the solution to central bank money printing is, number one, don't print money unless you know the economy can absorb it without causing inflation. The quantitative easing between 2010 and 2020 did cause inflation, but not in the economy as a whole, but in the housing market and the stock market, to benefit everyone who owned property and or shares. If the economy can absorb the newly created money, because it's got spare capacity and unemployed workers, the government can create climate solution bonds or affordable housing bonds. The central bank can then create the money to buy them, giving the money the resources to tackle these emergencies in exactly the same way as that it bought the bonds and debts off the corporations. This is a huge important piece for the climate movement. And there's a whole book written on it by a well-established British economist called Francis Coppola, called The Case for People's Quantitative Easing. Quantitative easing was the jargon used for printing money. They need a new jargon every 10 years so that people keep on being confused. And then the organization Positive Money was, it was a whole movement in the European Eurozone, quantitative easing for people as a rescue plan for failing economies using this different approach. And there they are demonstrating. Purple is the color of the organization Positive Money that does the leadership both in Britain and in Europe around all this new way of thinking. So now, back in 2016, a colleague of mine called Matthias Kroll put together a paper on how the world's central banks would come to the climate rescue. And he wrote this paper in quite an obscure way that was difficult to understand. So with his permission, I rewrote it. And I got him to sign on for it. And I wrote this blog called The Biggest Climate Solutions You've Never Heard of. So the Green Climate Fund and other dedicated climate finance institutions could create 300 billion a year of green climate bonds, perpetual bonds, interest-free, never have to be repaid. Because the central bank would like to pretend that they're going to repay all this money, but they never do and they never will. And 300 billion is a very small money compared to 41 trillion. They could then, the central banks then they print 300 billion a year to buy the bonds, and they give it to the Green Climate Fund and similar climate finance institutions. And this also could apply to biodiversity bonds, for biodiversity finance. These organizations could then offer the money as free public grants to approved climate solutions investment projects. And the investment community could find those projects then sufficiently enticing to invest up to 1.7 trillion a year, and the money will go ahead. Because the projects have been primed with the public money, which lowers the risk factors for private sector investors. So I included this thinking in this major paper I wrote called Climate Emergency, a 26-week transition program for Canada. This 26th thing is just a writer's scam. It means every week I unveiled a new policy. So this is the stuff I included. So here's how Canada could generate $59 billion a year for climate solutions, which would be close to 4% of GDP. The government could issue 5% green bonds, equivalent to war bonds, issued by the government, giving a 5% return, but guaranteed by the Bank of Canada as buyer of last resort. So they would be guaranteed to keep their 5% return. And these would be invested in all projects and initiatives that have a good return on investment, housing retrofits, solar energy, wind energy, all that stuff. The government could also have a network of public banks and have interest-free public bank loans for green purposes, climate purposes. So these are regular reciprocal loans that have to be repaid, but they're guaranteed by the Bank of Canada as buyer of last resort. So you expect to get the loan repaid, but if a company goes belly up for whatever reason, the loan is guaranteed. So the money the banks put out is guaranteed. And this could also be done by credit unions or even by private banks. There could also be pay-as-you-save utility loans and property-assessed clean energy loans to finance home retrofits and heat pumps and stuff like that, where the finance is repaid by the pay-as-you-save loans, or it's on your tax bill. So if you've got a property-assessed clean energy loan, the repayment is attached to your property title. So if you sell the house, the new owner continues repaying the loan because they benefit from the reduced price of energy because of the home retrofit you've done. But these loans could be guaranteed by the Bank of Canada as buyer of last resort, removing the risk from the hydro companies or the utility companies that are really wary of doing this in case they run up big losses. Bank of Canada, Government of Canada could also issue climate action bonds, which could be bought directly by the Bank of Canada using green quantitative easing, which I just explained, at 8.3 billion a year. And the fossil fuel subsidies could all be transferred to renewable energy or housing retrofits. Since they're existingly financed by the government, they'd be supported by existing taxation for no extra cost. And that's how you get $59 billion a year to finance the climate transition. So Positive Money they campaign for this stuff, they can reimagine money, banks, and the economy for the well-being of people, communities, and the planet. And that's my contacts, my email, my website, and my hashtag on Facebook and Twitter and all that sort of stuff. And I'm going to stop now and open it up for general mayhem.
Okay, that was wonderful, Guy. I know you live in British Columbia, and you'll be happy to hear that starting in July 2022, we are getting physical checks here.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. There you go.
Yeah, and then when you apply, and then when you do your income tax outside for people outside of for those of us who have the climate action incentive, there's a whole section on it now. Although more education is needed, because you're right, still people, even with that, people still don't know that they're getting money back from the carbon pricing. So I would like to leave this open to the audience. This was excellent. The money in the central banks belongs to all of us. I had one question for you, and it's pretty obscure, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Is this taught in school anywhere? Because I'm learning this with you. No, right. Okay.
It's first of all economics taught is neoclassical economics, which assumes that the market is perfect, that it'll always sort its own problems out, that labor unions are an unwarranted intrusion in the market, and that banking is a purely intermediary process. So if the bank have $100, they lend $100. They do not even acknowledge that banks create money. They certainly don't even discuss central banking at all. And I just read a major new book on new economics to end overshoot, to deal with ecological crisis. The whole book doesn't even mention central banks. Most people are bewildered and confused when you even mention central banks. They want to move on and discuss something else. So anyway, let's get some discussion going to and fro, as well as questions.
I'm going to unmute.
And people can use the raise the hand button in the left-hand corner to make it easy for Kathy.
Okay, Let's just look.
I know there's 17 things in the chat. I've not looked at them. I'm leaving that to you.
Yes, there is. Kelsey has a question. To play devil's advocate, what is the financial incentive to raise wages if lower wages are reducing inflation?
Oh, from the employer's perspective, none at all. I mean, there was the government of Canada going as far as a week-long strike to not raise wages, and the union stuck in there, and they got a deal. Wherever there are unions, you get good negotiated settlements. In Europe, they have a sectoral bargaining, when the unions representing an entire sector will all work together. And so you get stability across the economy. When you don't have unions, when they're not allowed, you get union workers feel disempowered. They're afraid of losing their job if they try to form a union. But obviously every employer puts pressure on the government not to raise wages. And they put pressure on government not to raise the minimum wage. And that neoclassical economists insisted for a long time, but by the laws of economics, the laws which do not exist, if you raise the minimum wage, it'll cause inflation. And, it'll cause unemployment. And there was a natural experiment that came up between two states in America. New Jersey was one, I forget the other, and they both one raised the minimum wage and one didn't. Zero impact on unemployment. But neoclassical economists work only from theory. They don't look at the practical world to actually see what's actually happening in the practical world. Yeah.
Jeffrey, and then Francois, s'il vous plaît.
Have fun. People can unmute themselves and ask the question directly, then I can see if they're gray hairs like myself or not.
They should be able to unmute themselves. Are you able to, Jeffrey?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Guy, for this really great introduction. The concept of how central banks could unlock this type of money was never clear. And I'm wondering how this gets, the political will for something like this gets created, because it, short of having you speak to each individual voting age Canadian, and even then, some of the concepts that you had that the banks, for every dollar of deposits, they can lend $20 worth of credit, basically, and create that money. I remember hearing that in Economics 100 eons ago, but even then, it took me quite a while to bend my head around it. So I'm just wondering, with very sophisticated concepts like this, how raise consciousness and get public acceptance?
Yeah, let me give a backstory to this, because in the 1950s, the Bank of Canada and 1960s used its ability not necessarily to print money, but to support major loans, to build the Trans-Canada Highway, the Gulf of St. Lawrence Seaway, and schools and hospitals. But in 1972, the Bank of International Settlements came knocking on the central bank stores and said, we want you to stop doing this. So they went to government stores and said, we want you to borrow your money from the private sector and not have central banks create that money. Which of course was massive benefit to the private investors. So from that date on, you can look at the debt accumulated by Canada's government, and it rises constantly and sharply. So in the 1970s, there was a big critique of this begun by a committee called COMA, the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform. And there was a lot of debate around this. And the debate went very sour, because some people got on board who says the banks are ripping off the public. And then it was the private banks are ripping off the public. And then it was the private Jewish banks are ripping off the public. And the whole debate got killed because it went to that horrible place, the old 1930s trope of, the Jewish bankers ripping off the world. So it toxified the whole debate and killed it for a long time. So to bring it back, really what is needed is a group like CCPA, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Jim Stanford, credible economists to get together and put a clear, coherent pitch together as to why this is possible. I'm not a trained economist, which is why I'm free to do this, because I'm not being brainwashed in neoclassical economics, but I don't carry the same credentials that some other people do. And I think that if the climate movement leaders went to them and said, can you look at this clearly and state this clearly, and then make a big thing of it and have a press release and make an announcement to but brief the journalists. Most journalists, who cover economic financial affairs, are not trained in that. And if they are, they're trained in the same neoclassical economics, and they don't really understand this stuff. But it would be a very important initiative for the climate movement to call a private Zoom call of 10 top economists together and get them on the same page. Yeah. I'm putting work on your desk, Kathy, here, right?
Well, we follow the money, and this is not what we'll be doing now, but it is all part of the grander picture that we're trying to see. And to our volunteers out there, don't feel pressured that you have to know these talking points or carry them forward. But another thing is to know that if the climate does crash and things go really sideways, quantitative easing and the central banks can really play a role in helping us get out of it.
The dilemma is, before we go to the next question, is that throughout the period from 2010 to 2020, when inflation was stuck at 2%, you could do this without causing inflation. Now that inflation is high again, it's a riskier proposition because you are pumping extra money into the market. So you've got to have a more careful analysis as to what the actual causes of the inflation are. And to the extent that if it is that 10% of wealthy people spending all that money, you can tackle that with wealth taxes to reduce general inflation, get it back down, and then go for quantitative easing for real public benefit and not for bankers' public benefit. Okay. More questions? I see Francois has got his hand up.
Yes, my question is, how does a guaranteed living wage that could be established and is in some countries, how does this fit into the mix that you have just described?
So it only fits in when I gave you that slide at the beginning with a whole list of things. It does not, from my way of thinking, fit at all into central bank money printing. That is not something you want to do. You're really interfering with the market there. So some people believe that you could do universal basic income with printed money. No, wrong, wrong, wrong. And the problem with universal basic income, and I'm sure I'm going to get some people's hackles up here, is that if you gave everyone a basic income of $1,000 a month, which is a major campaign to do, what's going to happen is that employers are going to say, oh, I don't need to raise your wages. And unions will feel much less pressure to raise wages. So there's going to be a slow wage creep downwards. Secondly, landlords are going to think, I can increase the rent because they can pay it. And there'll be an increase in rents. And childcare operators will say, oh, I can charge more for childcare. And after a few years, that basic income is going to be eaten by landlords and other people. And then you have to go back to the bank and say, well, we need another 1,000. The solution is universal basic services, where you put your effort into guaranteeing affordable transportation for everyone, affordable housing, affordable energy, affordable childcare, and affordable banking, all of which benefit everyone and can be driven by government policy in a much more sound way. But I really want to put universal basic services on the table instead of universal basic income, because when you translate affordable housing, transportation, childcare, etc., into cash equivalents, it comes to $1,500 a month of a basic income equivalent, because you're literally spending that much less money. You've got that money to spend if you're on a lower income. Anyway, back to you, Kathy.
That's fascinating. Okay, so this is from Rose. People's quantitative easing sounds fascinating. You said the protests for some are underway in Europe. Which banks, if any, are prepared to support it?
None. It's not a private bank's affair. And that protest was in 2017 when the European, before COVID. This is the banks, this is a government issue for politicians. And we have the dilemma that the central bankers have insisted on their independence because we've seen what happens in the past when incompetent governments that wanted to stay in power told their central banks to print money. So that the president of Zimbabwe say, oh, just print money, print money, print money, I got to stay in power. And it leads to terrible results. And yet, with that independence, if the central bankers interpret their mandate as purely being to keep interest rates low, and in America to sustain employment high, no one is giving them the message that their mandate needs to include tackling the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the affordable housing crisis. So that pressure needs to come from a negotiated discussion with the government, because you don't want a situation when the head of the Bank of Canada becomes a pawn in the hands of an incompetent prime minister or premier or president. Because you've got to finesse this carefully, and someone like Mark Carney, who was governor of the Bank of England and governor of the Bank of Canada, would in theory be the perfect person to do this. But he wrote a big book called Values, and I read the whole book. He never mentions what I'm talking about. He doesn't go there. He's not willing to take it this far, but a good sit-down discussion with him could maybe push the limits and see how far he would be willing to go, and make him accept the pure logical progression of thinking. Like, why should central banks should be there to serve the trust of the whole tribe, which is Canada as a whole. And if the affordable housing crisis can crash the whole economy, because when people are spending all that money on rent, they're not spending it in shops and stores. And the climate crisis could crash the whole economy. So the central bank should be engaged. Yeah, back to you, Kathy.
Excellent. Okay, what are the pros and cons of this approach versus the Green New Deal, i.e. job creation through infrastructure and subsidies?
They are totally, what's the word for it? Complementary. There's no clash whatsoever between them. This method of financing can be the finance needed for the Green New Deal. That's exactly how it works. Yeah, they work very well together. The Green New Deal and things like a Youth Climate Corps could all advance far more rapidly with this accessibility to finance on the table. But the government would need to prepare really carefully, because most Conservative MPs don't know the difference between government deficit spending and central bank spending and government bonds and stuff like that. And they do believe that government spending causes deficits and causes inflation. And it's just not true. But they hang on to that belief because it's a way to clobber government in spending and, make sure taxes aren't risen. That's a standard Conservative way of thinking around economics, which is very old fashioned. Yeah. I'm being so opinionated here, I'm sure I should. Whatever.
No, it's good to hear. Okay, just looking for other questions. Does anybody have their hand up? No.
There's a couple of questions in the chat down there.
Okay, are there more? Okay, there's more. Okay, how do you change the thinking of classical economists who are hired into the positions of responsibility because of their classical economic training?
It's a very, very important question. There are 10 schools of economics, one of which is neoclassical, and it dominates 90% of the space. And the other is ecological economics and feminist economics and behavioralist economics, fill up the rest of the space. You cannot get promoted in the realm of economics as an academic professional unless you publish in the 5 top journals of economics, which are controlled by neoclassical priests. And unless you write in neoclassical terms with complex mathematics that no one else can understand, you will not get published, you will not get promoted. So generically, the other schools are called pluralist economics. And I'm tied up with a journal in Britain called The Mint, which is a magazine of pluralist economics. And there are plenty of economists who are very frustrated with neoclassical economics. So then we come to the secondary question of when you have government employed economists in the Treasury and places like that, they use models to screen climate policies, for instance. And those models come from old-fashioned neoclassical economics, which says we can't, the future is worth much less than the present. So we'll discount the future by 2%. So any future impacts, negative impacts, are discounted by 2%, because it is assumed that we'll be more prosperous in the future. So economic growth will cover it. The truth is, the future is going to be worse. We need a negative 2% interest rate. Those models need to be questioned very harshly. And the American Prospect magazine coming out of Washington or somewhere in America did a whole issue on this matter just 2 weeks ago, looking at this modeling and how the false neoclassical, the dangerous neoclassical modeling is kiboshing really good policies. And it needs to change. They did their best to get attention in that magazine, but this is very difficult stuff for journalists to get into the media. But those models are how neoclassical economics is enforced in government departments and how bad decisions are made and good solutions don't get to see the light of day.
Oh, that's very interesting. This one, I'll get to Rolly and Mike in a few after these next two questions in the chat, and then that'll pretty much do it. So we've got 4 more questions, I think. So this one's from Karen. Do you have any comments on the work of economists who are arguing for modern monetary theory?
Yes. Modern monetary theory is basically exactly what I'm talking about. And it has been criticized on the basis by critics who don't read the clause about not doing it if there's a risk of causing excessive inflation. And the modern monetary economists agree to that. They say, you know, if the economy cannot absorb the money printed by the government, you're going to get inflation. They say there's zero risk of deficit spending because at the end of the day, the government can always find an opportunity to get the central bank can buy the debt, the accumulated debt from deficits off the government. The Bank of Japan has been doing exactly that for the last 15 years, quietly buying up the Bank of Japan's debt because Japan's got massive, biggest debt in the world. I'm not going to quote numbers at you. The critics of modern monetary theory misread it to imply that it's just going to cause inflation and it's magic thinking. And they are poorly informed on this in my analysis. I talked about my bookshelf. There's one of the major new books on modern. Can I grab it? Can I grab it? No, I'll leave it for now. Yeah.
Okay, so if the economy can't absorb it, then we shouldn't do it. But with the climate crisis, we have a giant hole in the economy. So perhaps we can absorb it. So
the dilemma is around employment and jobs.
Okay.
If you have very low employment, that means there are no workers available to do anything. You know, whether they're, installing solar turbines, putting up wind turbines, electrifying homes. These things all need labor. And so the only impact of pouring extra money in will be to increase the wages of employers desperate to hang on to their workers. But when I was younger, a natural rate of unemployment, I don't mean in the economist jargon, was around 2%. Now in Canada, it's listed officially at 5%. And in America, 5% actually means 10% because the way statistics are gathered, a lot of people are not counted if they go not being hopeful on it. So I believe there's a lot of slack hidden in the economy by people who just need a leg up to get a decent training in building retrofits or in the solar electrical work. And the extra capacity is there by workers who could earn decent money, but believe they've been disempowered in the economy and not doing very much. But it takes an analysis of the employment aspects of all this, because all those programs, most of them need jobs to do the actual transition. Yeah.
Hey, we had 2 more questions, but we'll get back to Kathy's at the end. So very briefly, is what you're suggesting something what was the government did to fight World War II?
Yes. Yeah. Well, in World War II, the government issued bonds, which the public can subscribe to, but the Central Bank of Canada, the Bank of Canada was thick into the mix. Same in World War I. Also, all governments do whatever they takes during a world war. But I haven't done enough detailed homework and to actually analyze the technical tools they made. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Rolly, and then Mike, and then we'll end with Kathy. And this has been amazing. We've got 5 minutes left, but we can go a little bit over because we started a little bit late. So Rolly, Mike, and then I'll ask Kathy's question.
Okay. Thank you for this great presentation. And I have to admit that some of it was a little bit over my head, but you mentioned the Youth Climate Corps that Seth Klein is promoting. And I'm just wondering, I know this is a very specific aspect of it, but what kind of economics would have to go behind that program? You just alluded to the fact that in World War II, the government of Canada stepped up. How would the government of Canada have to step up to that kind of program to have an impact, not only on job creation, but also on, raising awareness about the climate issues that are, yeah. I'll stop there.
It's the same as any other government program. It's something government spends money on, because the Climate Corps is not an income generator. It's a way to have young people get involved in doing stuff. And what I'd be really hoping is that the Climate Corps went out of its way to create jobs for disempowered youth who feel they're struggling and can't get a decent job, who left school at 16 or wherever, who dropped out, to bring them back technically into the labor market, but basically into the hope market. So they have hope and belief in their lives. But that slide where I had the $59 billion tucked away in there is the way to raise the money to pay for this, same as any government program, like dental care. It's just, it doesn't differ from those programs. But the employment aspect, you could easily attract all the climate keeners who've got great careers in front of them and have no problem in the employment market, and leave that minority of struggling young people, those who timed out of care, for instance, who were put on the streets at age 16 or 17, all on their own. They need the support through this kind of program. Yeah. Let's get to Mike before, I know his hand's up been a while, right?
Okay, well, thank you, Guy. It's you've made the monetary system very clear, and I particularly like the universal basic services. That does get around a problem with the basic income. I've seen it in Jason Hickel's book, but not so succinctly put. But my question has to do with, go back to the time when this economic structure started to be created, in which, before the Industrial Revolution, people had convivial economies where they were just taking care of each other, basically. And then we have increasingly been trained to become consumers, and then to lead our entire life as though the only thing going on is money, jobs, expenditures, and that sort of thing. And the project we're working on is more fun, less stuff, trying to bring back that conviviality, that what people did with their lives before we became consumers could erase or absorb a lot of the consuming urge and lighten up the pressure that these other things can go in and fill.
Yeah, I would say that before the Industrial Revolution, there were two kinds of economic society. There were tribal societies in clans where everyone supported each other. And there was no such thing as private wealth. It all got shared. And still, the pressure in an indigenous society, if you bring back a bunch of fish, you've got to share it. Other people were living in a feudal society. So outside the hunter-gatherer world, it wasn't a convivial society, it was a feudal society where you're struggling to pay rents and fees and debts to landlords and lords and feudal God knows what, who had brutal power over you. Between yourselves, you might sit together in the alehouse and have fun together and enjoy yourselves. And there certainly there's less work being done than in today's, what was the peak of the Industrial Revolution, an 80-hour week. But it wasn't really, if you study history hard, wasn't a very convivial existence. It was appallingly grim for an awful lot of people. But if we move back in that direction, say the good starting place is a 4-day working week. So we have a 3-day weekend in which people can actually spend much more time, not just recovering and shopping and being exhausted, but a whole day to make plans, to meet friends, to go on outings together, to have parties, to pursue hobbies, to do stuff creatively. That's a really easy achieved part of, recovering conviviality, because those things are much more fun done in work together. And the whole concept of developing quality in our lives instead of quantity, and getting off the consumerism, the sort of machine when you've got to have a bigger house and a better house. I've got friends who built houses for themselves and they think, how did this get away from me? Why is this house 20% bigger than it needs to be? And now my debts are 20% higher for the mortgage. And I got no time to pay the debts because I got to go and work all the time. They just needed to build a smaller house. So your thinking is really spot on this, Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, the more fun, less stuff is representative of an economy that's looking at the sort of things you've been talking about. Let's support human beings and rebuild the ecosystems rather than expanding the use of money.
Yeah. But the danger I warn you on is that among the 2/3 of Canadians who own property and those who are beginning to be comfortable with the mortgage payments, the world is a totally different place than the 1/3 of Canadians, or up to 40%, who don't own, who rent, and whose parents may not own, so they're never going to inherit. They will never have the chance of owning property. And their monthly bill determines their fear level and their stress level. And looking through that lens, the economy looks very different. But generally speaking, those people are not represented as MLAs and MPs. Most MLAs and MPs own property. They're not tuning into the reality of living in a trailer, of eviction, of landlords, of property owned by, big trust funds, and the abusive stuff that's going on at that level. And I don't even see enough noise come out of the NDP and the Green Party to address that level of struggle that's happening among people. I see it personally here. I meet people in the local park crying because they don't know what they're going to do after being evicted. Anyway, that's getting off topic, but the affordable housing crisis could be resolved with affordable housing bonds to pump that finance in and really maximize the scale of building, including making trailer villages and tiny homes villages, much to making them legal residences. Anyway, enough.
Thank you.
No, yeah, it was really good, Mike. And Guy, yeah, that was really good. Especially
And just to
thinking
throw
about-
in those columns in Corporate Knights magazines, I've covered an awful lot of these other topics. You just go to Corporate Knights and put in Dauncey in the search engine, you'll find all of them, right?
Okay, one more question. And then I know there's more hands, so I don't know how much longer you can stay.
I'm good for another few minutes, yeah.
Okay, we'll give it till 10 after.
Okay.
Okay, so this is from Kathy, just thinking about how this could work from a local practical view. Would this type of financing mean that I could access a low interest loan to convert my natural gas furnace to a heat pump and maybe install solar panels on my house? Who provides the loans?
You should be able to do that right now by going to your credit union or bank. The credit unions, alas, have annual elections. Anyone who banks with the credit union is an owner member of a financial cooperative. But with every credit union I know, with the exception of Van City, they've been taken over by the accountants. They don't let progressive ideas in. So some of the credit unions in Europe have special loan funds specifically for this purpose. The Bank of Canada could come in if the credit union says we'll do a zero interest loan, or and give a loan guarantee, so that if the credit union, if someone bailed on their zero interest loan and the bank's facing a loss of $30,000, that would be guaranteed by the Bank of Canada. No other institute could do that, but it could liberate the credit unions to an awful lot more lending and an activity of this kind, because it is money that can be repaid through the savings on the lower utility bills. Yeah, you've got to put the pieces together.
Glenn, do you want to ask your question?
Guy.
Look at those books Glenn's got there. She beat them.
Well, first of all, I have to have somebody teach me how to read. Anyway, I do not quite understand why your cheaper services, more efficient services, would make much of a difference on the employer and the landlord than a basic income. It seems to me that for example, the landlord would say, well, you're getting more services. That's the same as more money in your pocket. I will extract as much as I can from you. I'm wondering what your response is.
One of those affordable basic services is affordable housing. It is considered to be a service. And so one of the initiatives that the government adopting universal basic services would need to do is pull out every single solution that's available to solve the affordable housing crisis. And in the solutions I've been putting forward in this realm, we could eliminate rent entirely as a concept by enabling tenants to get together, form housing cooperatives, have the housing cooperatives financed by federal money, put the land in a community land trust. They control the thing. They've got tenancy secure for all their life. I believe that most rental situation is an abusive human relationship, except where it's purely a convenience thing, like renting a cottage for the weekend and stuff like that. And in the way it's done at the moment, we'd be better off without it entirely. If you live in a housing cooperative on low income, you have security of tenure for as long as you live. And if you're in a community land trust, your children can inherit the house, even if they don't inherit the land. So you have the psychic stability and security, and landlords are out of the picture. So that has to be part of it. And you raise a really good point, Glenn. If it's not included, the same problem would arise. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, taking fear out of the equation is so important. Thanks for bringing that to our minds and helping us think that through as we put forth policies. So this is from Adriana. How can how can universal services model be de-risked so as to accelerate co-created, more equitable, tenable approaches and economies?
That's a big sentence to unbundle. There's nothing inherently risky in universal basic services. We already do it with healthcare. The Trudeau government's just, with Jagmeet Singh, agreed to do it for dental services for lower income people. In many cities, we do it with public transit. We just need to extend it further so that low-cost public transit becomes a right in every city. That, cities where and public service is a safe bike route, so that everyone can get where they need by cycling and kids can get to school cycling. That is a public service. So it's just a matter of advancing it up the priority agenda list, because all government MPs and MLAs have a desk full of priorities chasing for their attention. And the stuff that makes the most noise is what gets attention. And if this doesn't make a noise, they can afford to ignore it because they're not going to get political payback. If it's seen as really popular and they act on it, they'll win political capital and not lose political capital. But there's not been enough clear discussion of this. Land value taxation is part of the affordable housing solutions, which I shan't go into now. I saw Joyce bringing that up. Yeah, we do. Yeah. If you go to Corporate Knights magazine, you'll find 2 pieces I've written on affordable housing solutions, and land value taxation is one of them. Yeah. Yeah. So if anyone's active in if anyone is in NDP policy circles or Green Party policy circles, please challenge the assumption that universal basic income is the way to go, because it may never get anywhere. It's a one or nothing, and universal basic services is an achievable thing that you can phase in steadily over a 10-year period and get it done piece by piece by piece in a more achievable way.
Well,
Alrighty.
I think that's it. The opposite of fear is love. So thank you for this. I look forward to reading your published book, The Economics of Kindness. This has been excellent, helping us see the economy in a different way, see where money comes from, and I'll leave it to you to share your last words with everyone.
The contrast between scarcity and abundance. Scarcity is scar-city, when people have got scares or wounded and hurt. Abundance is a bun dance. We're all celebrating with buns together. So just find ways to make fun with language and sort of keep positive, keep dreaming. And remember the 5th law of sustainability, that if it's not fun, it's not sustainable. We have to, because people listening to us do not want to go along with gloom and doom and oh my God. They want to believe in the possible future we can generate by all this great thinking and the great stuff we do. Then it's a joyful thing to engage in, and they want to be part of that movement. Thanks, everyone. If any of you know a publisher, please let me know, and talk again soon. Bye.